This week saw the beginning of a new political organisation, not party, although more of that in a second, as 7 Labour MPs left the opposition benches to start what they call the independent group.
This has not been an easy decision for any of us. We've all been Labour members of Parliament for very many years, in my case more than 3 decades. But the Labour Party we joined, that we campaigned for and believed in, is no longer today's Labour Party.
Now, the 7 MPs who did that weren't all that surprising. In fact, it was rather predictable. Gavin Shuker, Chris Leslie, Chuck Rumina, Anne Coffey, Luciana Berger, Mike Gapes, that's a person, not a sentence, were vociferous and publicly outspoken critics of Jeremy Corbyn right from the start. What was more, they'd almost all been subject either to a motion of no confidence or were facing the very real threat of being deselected. It's fair to say that nearly all of them jumped before they were pushed. The following day they were joined by Joan Ryan, another outspoken critic of Jeremy Corbyn and herself subject to a motion of no confidence. The following day the 8 Labour dissenters were followed by 3 Conservatives, as Heidi Allen, Sarah Wollaston and Anna Soubry joined the Labour MPs in trying to create what they claim is an alternative to a broken partisan politics of Labour and Tory.
Soubry endorsed George Osborne's chancellorship, which means she endorsed the welfare cuts and the welfare freeze. Can you agree with that? And can your ex-Labour colleagues agree with that?
You know what? Probably not. But it doesn't matter, because this is a fresh start. When you're in a political party, you're glued, if you like, to that manifesto, to that ideology, whether you personally agree with it or not. This is new, and the intention is to be very, very different.
Now, the fact this is not a political party, it's a political organisation, is important. It means a number of things. First and foremost, it means they can't be in receipt of the short money, or so we're told. This could add up to hundreds of thousands of pounds. Because they don't meet the requirements generally associated with being a political party. One of those is they don't have to be transparent about who is funding them in a way that political parties have to, although in their defence they're saying they will try and approximate those standards as best they can. Secondly, they don't have a membership, and while you can give them your contact and email details and even make a financial donation, there is no mechanism by which a mass of people can influence policy to this parliamentary party and then try and achieve policy outcomes at a national level. That's how we assume party politics works, whether it's in the United States or in Britain, whether it's the Tories, the Greens, the SNP or Labour. And yet here we see an exception. This is a private organisation more than a public political party.
You want to be a broad church. You don't mind if people come to join you that don't exactly agree with you on policy. What is the kind of...
Sorry, we don't have any policy. We're not a political party.
To say, well, you're not a political party, but you'll eventually have to stand for something. You'll have to become a political party.
It's those shared values, and it's really weird.
Wait a minute, you can't have the party of shared values.
No. All these things, I have no doubt, will happen and come about. That is not, if I may say, you're still stuck in the old way of doing things. This is something new and different. The thing that unites us is not just the values and the principles, but it's the fact that we are not tribal.
But we need to know what you're for, not what you're against.
But you do know what we're for.
And what presumably you're for are not just policies on Brexit, but if you were to stick together...
But we believe in sound economic policies and a sound economy that can fund first-class public services. We know that. We're tolerant. We believe in all those principles.
Where are you in taxation? Do you believe on low taxation? Do you believe in high taxation? Where do you believe in public spending?
I think what we believe in, and we've not even had these conversations yet.
But, hang on, what happens when you have them and you don't necessarily agree?
You cannot speculate like that. We just know between us as a group that we have these common values and these common principles.
But perhaps most concerningly, at least for me, is how 11 MPs who claim to want to renew Britain's democratic politics and who universally are tied together by the desire for a people's vote, a second referendum on Brexit, themselves say they shouldn't be subject to by-elections. In the words of Heidi Allen, having a democratic exercise would mean crushing democracy. If that sounds like doublespeak, that's because it is. The truth is they don't want by-elections because they know they would lose. And when you're an opportunist, you don't want to lose. What's perhaps even more interesting than all of that is how the 7 Labour MPs who left initially on the Monday said they were driven out of the party by a clear racist politics within it, and that this new formation will be guided by clear anti-racist principles. Now, So good so far, except within 3 hours, Angela Smith said the most racist thing I've ever seen an MP say on the television.
The recent history of the party I've just left suggests that it's not just about being black or a funny, different from the BME community. But
now, if you want to judge just how badly the launch of the party went, on the Monday, the video of the newly formed independent group had about 75,000 views on Twitter. The video of Angela Smith's apology got 700,000 views.
I've seen the clip on from Politics Live. I'm very sorry about any offence caused, and I'm very upset that I misspoke so badly. It's not what I am. I am committed to fighting racism wherever I find it in our society.
Even more impressive was that the original video of Angela Smith making that racist gaffe got more than 1.5 million views. And while the likes of The Guardian and the Daily Mirror wanted to splash on a video by Tom Watson which got 500 shares on Facebook, Novara Media's very own Ash Sarkar amassed 200,000 views, dropping heat on the corruption at the heart of the independent group.
What are the issues that people are going to be voting on? Not being Jeremy Corbyn, unfortunately, is not a manifesto in itself. People are going to be looking at things like your record on water privatisation. You're like one of the last people left in this country who still believes in it. They will look at the fact that you're on the all-party water group, which is mostly paid for by the water industry, and they'll go, you know what, that stinks of corruption.
Can I just say,
Now, that's a bad day. I mean, that's as bad as it gets in terms of launching a political party. But don't worry, the slick operator Chris Leslie was on Newsnight that evening. He was going to put it right.
Day one, you launched an anti-racism platform, and Angela Smith, one of your number, said something that was perceived by racists in as much as she felt she had to apologise for it.
Oh yeah, I mean she made a slip, and she has apologised for that. But I mean, at the end of the day, the issues that we were talking about were not just about anti-Semitism, were about Brexit, were about national security, were about a whole series of issues, but they all root back to a fundamental issue, which is that the Labour Party's become obsessed by quite a narrow, outdated ideology.
So we were told that the primary motivation driving this new party, its guiding animus, was a love, an adoration for democracy, so much so that they say we have to have a people's vote on whether or not we stay in the European Union. But the democracy thing can just park itself when it comes to by-elections and disenfranchising the hundreds of thousands of people who voted for these 11 MPs. Secondly, they claim to be driven by anti-racism, that they've been pushed out of the Labour Party because it hasn't dealt with it. And yet they set literally a world record for a new political organisation by being racist pretty much by lunchtime. But for Leslie, for Umana, for Heidi Allen, this is about more than racism or even Brexit. This is about creating a new centre ground in modern British politics. The fundamental belief that holds these 11 MPs together is they think, sincerely and honestly, that given the choice of not voting Labour or Tory, but basically for Labour 15 years ago, that much of the electorate would take it. That sounds nice in theory, but as I'm about to outline, it doesn't really have any evidence. If you look at the 2017 general election, 82% of the public voted for either the Tories or Labour. That was the highest share of the vote the two largest parties got since 1979, reversing a trend going in the opposite direction. In 2010, for instance, 65% of the public voted for Labour or Tory. The idea that people were turning away from the two major parties, especially when confronted with a real alternative between socialism and neoliberalism, simply is not true. And to say that people are disengaging from politics because they're not offered a real alternative of moderate, sensible policies, again, doesn't really stand up. Turnout went up in the 2017 general election, just as it was historically high for both the Scottish independence referendum in 2014 and the Brexit referendum 2 years later. And as much as they might not like to hear it, that was the biggest democratic exercise in British history. More people voted in that referendum than in any other referendum or election ever in the history of this country. What's more, Labour has more than 500,000 members. It's got more people actively involved than it has for generations. The same is true for the SNP. In fact, more people are members of political parties now than probably at any point in my lifetime. It seems pretty hard when you've got high turnout elections and more people voting for the two largest parties and more people being members of political parties to kind of hold up the claim that people are being turned off from politics, because all the data suggests the complete opposite. And if people were crying out for this new centrist party, then how come the Liberal Democrats, who we were told hit rock bottom in 2015 with about 8% of the popular vote, get even less 2 years later in 2017? We were told by all the political Einsteins that was going to be a Brexit election and that the moderate Lib Dems would do so well running between May's batshit Brexit Tories and Corbyn's neo-socialists, and yet their share of the vote went down. It would suggest almost that the media establishment has no idea what they're talking about when it comes to the public's sense of what they really want. And then there's the policies. Whatever your criticisms of Jeremy Corbyn or the Labour Party, anti-Semitism, etc., some I would agree with, some I wouldn't. The manifesto was incredibly popular. In fact, in a poll looking at why people voted Labour in 2017, their policies and their manifesto were right at the top of the list. And yet this new formation doesn't really want to imitate those highly successful and popular policies. Chris Leslie, in an interview with the New Statesman on Wednesday, said he was adverse to a top rate of tax at 50%. Now, that's not a Corbynite policy, that's a Gordon Brown one. In addition to that, he said he wasn't really a fan of scrapping tuition fees, and he also rejects the idea that we should bring rail back into public ownership. Both immensely popular policies, not just with Labour voters, but with Liberal Democrat and Tory ones too. In fact, IPPR and Sky News did polling at the end of last year, which goes beyond even the Labour manifesto from 2017. With clear majorities, the public saying they want the Bank of England to keep house prices down and for a minimal presence of workers on company boards. The idea that people are moving back to the centre, that they're craving a politics of the pre-financial crisis, is absurd. People are going left, and poll after poll on nationalisation, wages and tax tells us precisely that. And then there's the generational shift. In 1981, the last time there was a major split from the Labour Party, when the Gang of Four created the Social Democrat Party and were later joined by another 26 Labour rebels, it was clear that the zeitgeist was moving to the right. The ideas of post-war socialism were no longer popular. And yet the same week this break happened, The Economist magazine had a front page which I thought was probably their best ever, decrying the rise of millennial socialism, not just in the United States, but here in Britain too. As well as that, we saw protests across the UK by young people, not people my age, what's called Generation Z, as they said that politicians in Westminster had to address climate change, not just as something which is nice or a gleeful add-on, but something which must be at the core of a 21st century progressive politics. And it's no accident that these young people had some pretty catchy tunes when it came to describing the Conservatives. This is the electorate of the 2020s. My hunch is, if you're worried about how left-wing millennials are, you ain't seen nothing yet. And the idea that these people will be bought off, as their parents and grandparents were, by conservative ideas and policies, simply cannot hold. They're not left-wing because of something they read in a book or because they want to be countercultural. They're left-wing because their living standards and expectations are lower than what their parents are. They're going to enjoy a less expansive welfare state. They're going to have higher levels of debt. They're going to earn less. And as a generation, they're going to have to deal with systemic crises like demographic aging and climate change. They feel really screwed over. And guess what? They're right. That's why they're turning to what The Economist calls millennial socialism. The idea that these same people are going to look at Chris Leslie and say, you know what? I want politics to be like Which magazine too. It's probably the dumbest thing you're going to hear this year, and we're only in February. But what's perhaps most galling of all is that we see this play out time after time, particularly since 2015, where centrist politicians get absolutely hammered. Now, the most well-remembered example of that, of course, is Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election in the United States. She was facing Donald Trump, one of the most unpopular candidates of all time. The only problem being she was more unpopular. Sadly, it took her losing before she could even recognise the fact she wasn't a very good candidate. No, wait. 2 years later, she still hasn't done that. Then there's Emmanuel Macron, the president of the French Republic. 2 years ago, people were touting Macron as the saviour of European centrism, despite the fact he only ever took 24% of the popular vote in the first round. Now he's the most unpopular president in the history of France, after facing months of street protests by the Gilets jaunes, people who've been subject to tear gas attacks on a daily basis by the police, with people losing eyes, limbs, and some even dying. But don't worry, there's not just Clinton and Macron, there's other people too. Do you remember Matteo Renzi? In 2014, the Partito Democratico in Italy, the Democrat Party, the sister party of Labour, took 42% of the vote. Here was salvation. You didn't need to vote for Corbyn or the radical left. Look, sensible, moderate politicians, they can win too. And yet, within a couple of years, he was out. He'd lost a referendum by 20 points. And in the last general election in Italy, the Democrat Party lost half of their senators. Who govern there now? The Five Star Movement and the far-right Lega. The idea that centrist politics have done particularly well in Italy, just as they did with Hillary Clinton or France, is clearly ridiculous. Then, even more recently, we had Pedro Sanchez, again, the Prime Minister and leader of the PSOE, the Spanish sister party of Labour. And the sad thing is, yes, he's nice looking, he's telegenic, and this is all these people want. They want a nice smiling face administering austerity. He's also been subject to massive protests, and this week Spain called new general elections and the PSOE are almost certain to lose. So if you look across Europe for inspiration in regard to centrism, a project which these people could imitate, it really isn't there. Their response instead is just to keep on going, Justin Trudeau.
We like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind.
Well, guess what? Justin Trudeau today is less popular in Canada than Donald Trump is in the United States. Not that these people will talk about it in the various news programs they host or magazines and papers they write for and edit. So the zeitgeist, both here and abroad, don't really seem favourable to a new centrist party, which was most definitely the case in 1981. What's more, as I've said, there isn't really inspiration these people can draw. There are no successful precedents for a successful centrist politics pretty much anywhere in the world. The reason being that reflects a fundamental crisis of capitalism, which has remained unsolved since the 2008 global financial crisis. The bet that this politics made was that rising growth premised on financialisation was sufficient to pay for improving public services. The only problem being financialisation hasn't created growth since 2008. So how the hell do you pay for better public services and address increasing income inequality? The point is you can't, which is why all these people have had since is austerity with a nice smiling face. Now, if I'm trying to be charitable, I need to obviously look at the people involved and say, what do they have in common? What could they do here? Yes, one is Brexit, but there's a few other things as well. Of all the 8 Labour MPs who defected to this new independent group, every single one voted against an investigation into Iraq. Now, people say to me, well, Aaron, Brexit's now, Iraq was in 2003. Say that to the million people who died as a result of the Iraq war. Say that to the people affected by ISIS, a direct outgrowth of the fact we made a huge power vacuum in the region. Say that to the people who are upset with the expansion of Iranian influence, not just in Iraq, but across the Middle East. Again, a direct consequence of disrupting the balance of power between the various countries in the region. The idea that Iraq is somehow irrelevant is not just absurd, but a disgrace. People have died, and it's made one of the most important geopolitical areas in the world more volatile and more turbulent than ever before, and Britain is directly responsible for it. But it's not just Iraq, don't worry, it's also welfare benefits. Every single one of the 8 Labour MPs who defected abstained on welfare reform in opposition. This is, of course, before Corbyn came to power. So if you want to understand the core guiding principles of these people, it's certainly not on a more progressive foreign policy, and it's certainly not on creating a more just social system here at home. This is an interesting mix where opportunism and careerism pose under the guise of the national interest, where people say they are trying to stop Brexit, when in fact what they're doing probably makes a no deal more likely than before, where they say they are driven by fundamental democratic principles, but they won't stand in by-elections.
You're still stuck in the old way of doing things.
No members, no policies, no party democracy, no vision. I struggle to see how the independent group is set to take Britain into the 2020s. It's not the future of politics in this country. It strikes me very much as the past and the worst aspects of it at that. If this really is a party which centrists and moderates and sensible people want to attach themselves to, more's the better, because it's going to be found out very quickly. And if we want to establish the primacy and preference of socialist ideas, bring it on.